on, so we're live now. All right. So as I mentioned, we're going to sort of plow through this Aboriginal uh, religious traditions, and just a couple things to start off with. One, there are sort of a multiplicity of Aboriginal religious traditions. So we're looking sort of at the broad scape and not one tradition in particular or one tribal group's sort of expression of Aboriginal religious tradition. Some examples that I give, and then the stuff that I'm going to upload from these two books, uh, they break down in different points, look at some of the different traditions individually, and talk about how different tribal group, Aboriginal groups sort of express certain things as examples. Um, and we're also not going to look at the broad question of religions in Oceania sort of more broadly, which includes Papua New Guinea and all these other places, even New Zealand. We're just going to look at Australia. And so for that final paper, you have to do, you're just going to look at the Australian expression of Aboriginal religious traditions. So even some of the stuff that I'm going to upload talks about some of the other traditions. I tried to minimize it and do chapters that just really focus on Australia, but there is some discussion of other Papua New Guinea, Fiji, etc. So, um, and there's some crossover. The other important thing to say is that um, because there's a multiplicity of traditions in Australia, when you write your paper, you can do it in the broad sense. You don't have to sort of categorize, well, this is only true for this tradition, because we're not going to go that in depth into one specific tradition. So I don't want you all to sort of get too hung up on that. If you were writing a traditional research paper, that would be more important. But here, you can do that sort of broader overlook. Uh, and some of the stuff I'm going to upload does look at modern day expressions and how Christianity has intermixed with it. If you want to talk about that in your paper, that's fine too. You can bring it forward to the modern day. Mostly what we're going to look at and what I'm going to talk about is just really sort of what ethnographers, scholars of religion, and sociologists and so forth have sort of studied from a historical perspective, going all the way back to the early, when Western society began to interact with Aboriginals. So I'm not really going to talk much about today's expression, although you can rightly imply or sort of assume that the Aboriginals still in general will practice and do many of the rituals that we're going to talk about. So even in modern day. So you can just sort of extrapolate that if you want, but we're not going to focus on that because, you know, um, we're only spending a short time on this, and it's already. I don't want to give you so much information. So, all right. The prevailing picture of Aboriginal socioeconomic scene, and this is really sort of the historic picture, um, was of semi-nomadic bands of societies. So, there was lineages or small kin groups engaged in hunting and gathering across the land. And they recognized as shared with bands of the same ancestries or languages. And so historically, the Aboriginal sort of lived in the continent of Australia and wandered sort of in geographic regions, and for the most part lived in those geographic regions and hunted and gathered. Um, you're going to see how that plays out as I go forward in this lecture this morning, because land and ancestors are central to the Aboriginal religious experience writ large. So this is true for most of the Aboriginal groups. But just as a general uh, stating, they were semi-nomadic and they lived sort of in tribal or linguistic or ancestral groups. Looks like Josh is joining us. All right. So, all right. Anyway, and there are two terms that have been central to the understanding of religions in Oceania, and including Australia. And those are the terms mana, M-A-N, and taboo. And here taboo is spelled in traditional way of T-A-B-U, but obviously we spell taboo with two O's. But both of these words have been central to sort of um, the understanding of religions of Oceania, including Australia. There are some other terms that we're going to see in a moment, but I just want to put that out. And we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at these two terms per se. Uh, but I want you to know that these terms have sort of significant meaning overall. Um, the next term, and this one is specific to Australia Aboriginal traditions, uh, and that was Kobong, K-O-B-O-N-G. Um, George Grey, who was appointed the governor of New Zealand back in the 1800s or so, um, related this term Kobong to the Native American term totem. Um, Now, this is going to be play out in more important, and we'll see how this plays out as we go forward. But this term Kobong was really an Aboriginal term for Australia. Um, and in recent years, scholars who study Aboriginal religious traditions have decoupled the word Kobong from totem as it's sort of traditionally understood by Westerners. Um, and so, and they want us to understand that totemism in Aboriginal religion is very different than totemism in Native American religion and culture. And I say that because you're going to see in a moment how totemism, which is really based on sort of animistic spirit worship, uh, is central to Aboriginal religion in Australia, but it's very different than totemism in Native American spirituality, or maybe in other religious traditions that have totemism. So I point that out because this is an important concept. Um, and Australian Aboriginal religion is grounded in the belief of spiritual beings. And these spiritual beings are one's ancestors. So ancestral spiritual beings, not ancestor worship in the way that we might find in some other religious traditions, particularly like in Buddhism when we talk about it there, but here ancestors are actual spiritual beings, and that's the grounding. And so hence we might more broadly say that Australian Aboriginal religious traditions are animistic religions. And animism means the belief in spirits. Um, and although animism may not paint the entire picture, um, Merritt, who was an anthropologist, argued that the word or concept of mana might well have been a precursor to animism. And so this is where mana comes into the sort of religious tradition in Aboriginal society. And he was drawing on the writings of Codrington. And Codrington wrote in his book, The Melanesians, he wrote this: mana is a power or influence, not physical and in a way supernatural, but it shews itself in physical force or in any kind of power or excellence which a man possesses, or here we would say a person. This mana is not fixed in anything but spirits, whether disembodied souls or supernatural beings have it and can impart it. And then Merritt concludes that mana is a basic feeling of a powerful awe which precedes and underlies any belief in spirits proper. This is really important here. Now, the way that Codrington talked about it as sort of being disembodied uh, is not how Aboriginals understand it. And that's really important. And you'll see this going forward. But Aboriginals do see their ancestors in their spirits being in many things. And you'll see how that works out. But Merritt believes that maybe this notion of mana here maybe even pre-existed the sort of animism or spirit belief that exists in Australia. So I just want you to have that out there. Okay, so before I move forward, and we're going to look now at the key concepts, I want to note that some of these concepts or beliefs are widely held by many different Aboriginal groups in Australia, and others are less widely held or vary somewhat in their meaning. So the key concepts that I'm going to present now and talk about are sort of overarching concepts that most Aboriginal groups hold, but not all of them do, and some of them may express them in slightly different ways. So this gets to the point, back to your papers, when you're writing, you can do this from the sort of 30,000 view and generally say that these are held by most Aboriginal groups. Okay, so the first concept is dreaming or dream time. And in order to understand this concept of dreaming or dream time, we need to first understand a bit about how Aboriginal society and people understand the concept of time itself. Okay, and space as well. So views on how Aboriginals understand time has shifted over the decades and centuries. The Romantics of the 17 and 1800s and maybe even early 1900s viewed the Aboriginals as sort of timeless people, meaning that time just was not really important and they just sort of existed in a sort of timeless realm. You know, that's a very romantic notion. It also, for some, sadly, was sort of had a racist tinge to it. But in general, it was a very romantic notion. But more recently, some scholars have viewed their Aboriginal understanding of time as having sort of a weak sense of historical time. And finally, there are those who maintain that Aborigines have a different sense of time, which is circular or cyclical in nature rather than lineal. Now we're going to unpack these a little bit, and then I'm going to posit maybe from the philosopher theologian Paul Ricoeur. He understands Aboriginal time as being rhythmic, but I want to look for a moment first at these other views and how they didn't quite understand the concept of Aboriginal time. While it's true Aborigines in traditional culture did not recall events beyond 2 generations, and they didn't have a means for reckoning events in terms of some measured calendar. And the reason they didn't have a means to do that is because Aborigines didn't count. They didn't have a concept of counting. They did have a concept of duality and trinity, but it wasn't in a numerical sense. And so if you don't count, you don't have a way to record multiple events, meaning days, months, and years. It's just not possible to do that. And hence, we could say that they did not nurture a lifestyle based on temporal philosophy. And so their philosophical view of the world or their world view was not temporally based. And this is important because Western societies, for the most part, are highly based in temporal sort of philosophical understandings. You know, we create calendars and dates and times, you know, and so forth. And that was not how they did it. And so the philosopher and theologian Paul Ricoeur suggested that Australians have a rhythmic understanding of events, which really requires no reference to time. For example, and here's one I'm going to use a specific tribal or Aboriginal group, the Aranon um, of Central Australia are able to name over 30 qualitative changes that occurred over what we would call a 24-hour period. And this is how they describe the events. The Milky Way is stretched out across the center of the sky. The Bindicoots back into their burrows. The shadows are variegated. The sky is aflame with uh, red and yellow. Now, this is a precise and sort of poetic means of ordering life, but it does not refer to concrete events in ways that we Westerners would understand the keeping of time, and therefore we would say that they are not keeping track of time. And this is where Paul Ricoeur developed this notion of rhythmic time or rhythmic uh, understanding of time. The patterns reoccur, but they are not said to go back to some beginning. Therefore, it's rhythmic rather than cyclical. So the Milky Way being stretched out is going to reoccur. The Bindicoots going back to their burrows is going to happen, but it's not happening back to some point in time. So it's not a cyclical understanding of time. All right, so now back to dreaming or dream time. This is not a different type of time, but rather a different class of events. We might call these abiding events. And here, when I use the term abiding, it's to refer to the notion of eternal. Yet, on the other hand, it gives a connotation of being place specific and belonging to an abode. This is going to become quite important and central to Aboriginal life. So this notion of the eternal and a specific time or place connected. This dream time has its locus in the Aboriginal concept of that which springs from inherent eternity. Here, eternity is not a time past, present, or future, but only implicitly so. And what this means, for in fact, the real reference is not to time, but to space, or more correctly, places. So the inherent eternal is actually in a place. And so therefore, the place is both past, present, and future. Obviously, unless you destroy the place. But as long as the place exists, it's past, present, and future. And dreaming is used in two specific contexts, referring to certain abiding events, which are embodied in stories, songs, and emblems, etc. And then two, referring to the places which house the sacred power of which the stories tell. So we can rightly say then, we have dreaming events or dreaming places. Dreaming is both and reality, eternal, and specific and place specific. So dreaming here is not like the dream state that you and I engage in when we go to sleep, but it's really a time for them that is eternal and place specific, meaning it is connected to the land, the rock, the mountains, the river, the tree, the fish, etc., where one's ancestors made their home and abode, where their ancestors dwelled. Everybody with me so far? I don't want to stop if there are any questions at this point about this concept of dreaming or dream time. All right. Okay, so the next concept, the next key concept is cosmology. Um, and cosmology is basically the Aboriginal understanding of the cosmos, okay? That's what cosmos means, and the origins of life and so forth. That's the big idea of what cosmology is. And Aboriginal cosmologies are never systematized into a grand doctrine, but are instead always implicit within the multitude of stories. So their cosmologies are about stories and what's implied in the stories. This lack of centralized mythic coordination is essential to the nature of Aboriginal life. So if you're a Westerner and you're a practicer of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, you have a cosmology that is systematized. Now, it may be highly systematized or loosely systematized, but there is a set type of cosmology that each one of you can sort of tell and retell, and it can be written down, and it obviously starts with the Godhead in this case. For the Aboriginal, this is not the case, and therefore we cannot create a singular unified cosmology, even within one Aboriginal community. So even in an Aboriginal community, there might be varying cosmologies. So as we talked about Hinduism the other day, this might in some way connect more closely in a loose sense to Hinduism, because there's a variety of cosmologies in Hinduism as well. All right. And there is no one primary ancestor story. And this, you'll see, is important, even though ancestors seem to be central to most, if not all, the Aboriginal traditions. And so there's no primary ancestor story. So, for example, back to the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic faith traditions, we have a central ancestor story, and that's the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all share that central story as the origin of where human beings came from, and they were created by God. Aboriginals do not have any such original one ancestor story. All right. What we can say is there are likely four elements in the cosmologies of the Aboriginal people. And so the first element is something exists. Now, that obviously seems sort of, well, duh, something exists. But here's what they mean by that. We are not told what pre-exists the ancestors, if anything, or where the ancestors first came from. We are simply told in their stories that something does exist. The second of the four elements are that something becomes active. In a sense, Aboriginal myths deal with a passage in which inactive ancestral potentials move and act and then become immobile again, like Ayers Rock, for example. If any of you know, Ayers Rock is a famous Aboriginal site in the middle of Australia. And it is part of this ancestral story. It was a mobile ancestor. It was a living being that could move and act, and then it became immobile again and formed this rock. The third one is, through the activity, certain aspects of life are given order and shape. In myths, we see elements belong to what we might consider as moral, economic, ritual, and geographical domains. So the activity gives shape to, order and shape to life. And then the fourth is ancestors taking on an enduring form as a terrestrial or celestial place. And again, back to Ayers Rock. So now the ancestors of that Aboriginal group are that rock, and that's the enduring form that they've taken on. All right. In all this, it should be noted that cosmic order is derived from a multitude of events in which countless ancestors travel and transform themselves into sites. So it just isn't one, the Ayers Rock is one example, but even in that Aboriginal group, they have other ancestral sites, and other ancestors that moved and operated. And you'll see how this plays out as we move forward. But I just want you to understand that this is a multiplicity of these events. It's not one singular event for each Aboriginal group. This is very different from cosmologies that focus on a single Godhead or other ultimate principle reality of sacred authority upon which the universe was and is dependent. So any cosmology that has a Godhead or some other ultimate reality that the universe is dependent on is categorically different than Aboriginal cosmology, because they don't have that singular Godhead or singular reality. The universe is ordered by the multiplicity of these ancestors and the ancestral place. Everybody with me so far? Is that making sense?
Yep.
All right, great. All right. All right, so moving on. Strictly speaking, there is in Australian Aboriginal traditions no creation story and nor a first creator. I've already hinted at that, but I just want to make sure that we understand that. The myths avoid questions of first origin and instead begin from the assumption that life potential of the ancestors simply existed, as I pointed out in those four categories or elements. Likewise, the issue of who made the ancestors or the world is not addressed. So these kind of questions about the origin of the ancestors and who made it are really meaningless to Aboriginal cosmology and theology. What this means is Aboriginal religious traditions don't regress in either time or structure to a single point, as monistic traditions do, but rather are in their very nature always pluralistic. So in their very essence, Aboriginal traditions are pluralistic. All right, there are two other parts to their cosmology, and those are consciousness and relatedness. And for Aboriginals, humans are the moral and intellectual beings they are because all existence, as laid down by these abiding events, these dream states, has consciousness. So everything that exists has consciousness. Ancestors must have a conscious intentionality revealed through their actions so that all that exists might also be conscious. So any Ayers Rock, back to that again, has a consciousness. This is why Aboriginal people have been so against many of the things that the Australian government has done when it comes to digging up the land, the use of the land, and so forth, because the land itself has consciousness. And obviously, you're hurting that, or damaging that consciousness, which means you're also hurting the living Aboriginals that are there. While Aboriginal religion has a high degree of local autonomy and independence, there is a sense of cosmological relatedness. The Australian continent itself is crisscrossed by a network of pathways which employ the pathways established by the ancestral beings. And so while the ancestors move, they do not move from one place to another place, but rather their existence remains simultaneously throughout the entire pathway. So that at a basic level, Aborigines conceive of pre-established lines of cosmological relatedness permeating the world. And so what that means for the Aborigines is that the entire continent of Australia is crisscrossed by these pathways, these conscious states of their ancestors at any given moment. And so again, you have to honor the sacredness of those pathways when you're moving about. All right. And the Aborigines, therefore, assert they are their land and They're totemistic species. That is, they share the same localized ancestral spirit. So Aboriginals believe that they are both the land that they're on, they are literally part of it, and you'll see that in a moment, and they're also part of the totemic species, meaning they are their ancestors as well. So they are in effect a living representation of their ancestors. Now, this isn't different than other religious traditions that also believe they carry some sort of uh, element of the divine within them. Here, the difference is it's not a divine Godhead or a divine God, if you will, or a supernatural being, but rather they're carrying their ancestors within their own being. All right. So the next key element is maintaining this cosmos. They have to maintain it. An Aboriginal ritual is designed to maintain, meaning keeping in good working order the link between the lands and the people of the land. So I'm going to give an example of a ritual because I think this is helpful. A person who shares a site's spirit. So that would mean a person from that land or that location visits that place, and in a particular focal area, it might be a simple pile of stones or a rock painting or something, the person will sing a song to the ancestor while engaged in some uncomplicated ritual act, such as rubbing the stone or uh, some other act. There are more elaborate examples. And so, in a more elaborate form, there's a spiritual custodian. Many of these sites have spiritual custodians. So, these are people that actually dwell at that site and function much like we would say a priest or a rabbi or a shaman or something, but they're spiritual custodians. And that person might be decorated with red and white vegetables down and a headdress so that he, in fact, embodies the ancestor in animal form and makes manifest behavior which leads to cosmic balance. So here, the spiritual custodian actually engages in some elaborate ritual. Now, there may be other people involved in it, but the spiritual custodian is engaged in this much more elaborate ritual. It's important to note that only a person who shares the ancestral spirit can perform this ritual. So, in order to share an ancestral spirit, one must be born from the same land as the ancestor. All right. Now we're moving to the next key element, and this is the emergence of life from land. All right. All life in Aboriginal cosmologies and traditions, so this is across all the traditions, all life emerges from land. While the Aboriginals understand that a baby comes out of a mother's womb, they do have that understanding. Uh, the baby, meaning life itself, originated in a specific place, which is imbued with an ancestral presence. And that specific place could be a stream, it could be a fish, it could be a tree, it could be a lot of places, but it's imbued with that. And the life form, the baby, moves from that place into the mother's womb. It's transported into the mother's womb. Therefore, a person belongs to the land from which he or she, which his or her spirit emerges. And this is the place for which he or she must perform these cosmic uh, balance rituals. So the Aboriginal, when they're doing these cosmic balance rituals, has to go back to that specific ancestral place and perform the ritual. And someone else from another ancestral place, while they might travel through that region, they can't perform some kind of cosmic balance ritual there. It will have no efficacious value. Okay. it's important to note that in general, although not exclusively, children share the ancestral essence of their father, meaning transmission of rituals and territorial rights are through the father's ancestral spirit and not the mother's. Um, and that's important to note because while women have an important role and birth is quite important in Aboriginal religious traditions, because life originated in the earth, in the land, that is really central to their narrative. And so, really, you might say the mother and the womb are a vessel here rather than essential to it. And in fact, in some of the Aboriginal traditions, right after the baby is born, a hollow in the earth is created, and the baby is actually put in that hollow to signify that the baby actually came from the land. All right. The final thing I'm going to highlight, and this I'm just going to really make note of, and then I'll open it up for any questions you have. There's two other key concepts, and that's the making of men, which is the rituals that boys go from boyhood to adulthood. There is some rituals for women as well, but they're far less elaborate, and they're not as universal. But there are the ones for making of men are quite elaborate and universal. And the other is death rituals. And we just don't have enough time this morning to talk about them. In the readings I'm going to upload, it goes into great detail about both of these, and there's a lot. There's also detail about the women and some of their rituals as well. And so it's important that you make sure you read the things that I'm going to upload aside from the notes. But also, if you have questions along the line, to reach out to me about that. Okay, I'm going to stop and open this up for questions because I just went through a whole lot of stuff.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So how often would one need to return to their ancestral place in order to maintain that balance?
That's a great question. And so the sort of larger cosmic balance, those might be specified rituals. And now remember, there's no timekeeping, right?
Right.
So how often one does that is really back to that dream time,
I
okay?
see.
But having said that, the hunting and gathering, there always needs to be rituals going on around hunting and gathering, okay? Because you need to maintain cosmic balance to ensure that you have enough animals. And so the cosmic balance sometimes might be to decrease things or increase things. It's important for us to see that this isn't simply a balance of just keeping it neutral. Sometimes, for example, if you had too many deer or antelope, as the case may be, you might have to have a cosmic ritual that decreases the number of antelope or deer, okay? Whereas if you didn't have enough fish or something, you might have to have a cosmic ritual that increases the fish population. And so these rituals, in that sense, for hunting and gathering, need to be continuous because the belief is that they're creating the balance that allows the people to survive, okay?
Yeah.
The larger ones of keeping the sort of general balance of the sort of cosmos itself, those rituals probably are performed less frequently and more likely are performed by the sort of custodians. Uh, and then the sort of general things, the Aboriginals don't see death and health and illness the same way we do. If you died prematurely, meaning they expected and assumed people to live to old age. Now, I don't know what old age in Aboriginal timekeeping was, but they expected people to live to old age, okay? And so if someone died prematurely, they believed sorcery was involved.
Oh, wow.
And they actually had investigators, coroners, that would go out and investigate what type of sorcery was involved because it had to be some kind of human activity that caused the premature death of a person. Uh, and so in that sense, those kind of rituals and that kind of activity might be, again, would be necessary whenever those events take place. Illness, on the other hand, uh, the way they understood that, again, was somewhat different than how we understand illness. So, they might have done, they didn't necessarily do rituals for balance in that, but they still had some kind of, um, shaman or a doctor that did some kind of medicinal care for people. Okay. Other questions? John, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Sorry.
That's all right. Do you have any questions?
I think I got it.
All right, Josh, do you got any questions?
I don't think so.
All right, Alec, how about yourself?
I think I'm all set.
All right. So I will, get this stuff uploaded, and Monday we'll regather at our normal 11 o'clock time, and we'll start looking at Judaism on Monday.
Sounds good.
Have a great weekend, everybody. I hope you can all at least get out and enjoy it. The weather's supposed to be great, so at least get out and do something nice. All right. Take care, everyone.
See you later.